This episode is brought to you by Palamon's Fine Cutlery. Remember, when you stand up in front of your guests to carve that roast, you don't want to look like a putt sawing at it like a carpenter heaving over a 2x4. You want one of Palamon's professional class blades that can cut through flesh and bone in one fell slice like it was warm butter. Each Palamon blade is ingeniously wrought by a famous craftsman you've never heard of, and each cutting blade employs Palamon's distinctive patented mercury embedding, so that when you bring the blade down on a bird or brisket, it heaves into the meat like a Robespierre guillotine. Included free is a handy whetstone and oil to keep your set of blades ready for every task. As a firm supporter of equality of the sexes, each Palamon blade has a male and female side. And when they order a full set of Palamon culinary and table knives, our listeners can have each one engraved with a meaningful motto like Caveat Digitus, or Eat What You Kill, or Happy Birthday, Martha Jean. Just order your set at their website and use the promo code REREAD, one word. And thank you, Palamon Fine Cutlery, for sponsoring the Rereading Wolfe podcast.
Warning. The following discussion is deliberately riddled with spoilers and unhinged speculation on this nearly 40-year-old book, Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. You can't read a Gene Wolfe story. You can only reread a Gene Wolfe story.
Welcome to Rereading Wolfe. We'll abandon the literary artifice that this is the first time you and we have read these books. We're going to try to understand, and that means considering the books as a whole.
Hi, I'm James Wynn.
And I'm Craig Brewer. Well, it's been a pretty active week, relatively. So not lots of arguing, but we did get some nice comments, emails, and some DMs this time about...
Yeah, chapter 13 and earlier.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, what is there to fight about in chapter 13, really? It's not a heavily contested chapter.
No.
Michael Andre Drisi reached out to us on email. To applaud a chapter 13 episode and to commiserate with us about our frustration with Citadel geography. We were surprised to realize that the corpse door is in the Citadel curtain wall, the wall that's made of unsmeltable metal. Mm-hmm. And Michael said, there was a little confusion about walking from the oubliette to the master's chambers that made it sound to me like Sev was walking from a jail outside the tower rather than looking out through the open door as he passed. Probably you figured it out. Curtain wall, corpse door, Brother Porter. So the boys returning home in chapter 1 knew that Brother Porter wouldn't give them a hard time. It was just the oddity of the guard, also not a problem, not being at the Necropolis gate, and the unknowing volunteers coming along that made a problem. Seems like it. I sympathetically agree the local geography is as slippery as quicksilver. Yeah. Also, Michael, still thinking about the house as your temptation illustration. Craig, you and I went straight to Christ's temptation in the wilderness, the conciliator version. But Michael and Nigel Price thought that it was most properly in the Garden of Eden. Michael's been rereading Operation Ares and feels like he sees a temptation scene there as well, when the protagonist enters a strip club / brothel, and there are a pair of sisters on stage, one with a robot snake. As he notes, I think Wolfe repurposed a lot of bits from that freshman attempt at a novel. So, Michael might be right.
Means also that he really liked that image.
Yeah.
that's one not necessarily one I would have wanted to get back in, but he really had fun with it.
That was a crazy image, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Obi-Wan Spicoli, great handle, reached out to us on Reddit. He said some nice things. Love the podcast. Look forward to hearing more. And
we'll always take that.
Yeah. And proceeds with a kind of correction and kind of clarification. We were discussing the craziness at Piteous Gate at the end of Shadow of the Torturer and how it was the Ulans that attacked the travelers leaving Nessus, which has its own level of insanity. People would go through those gates in such numbers when you're such an easy pickings. And I mean, it's not really a big mystery because Wolfe himself answered the question in an interview. But Obi-Wan Spicoli, somewhat exasperated at everyone's density, demonstrates that Wolfe did not exactly hide that what happened at the gate.
Mm-hmm.
He's tried for years, he says, to end wild speculation on the event without supporting evidence. The first tip, of course, is Palamon's warning to Severian about those Ulans in chapter 13, that the roads are closed. The next he proffers is in chapter 12 of Claw of the Conciliator, the Noctuals. It goes, "The day before we had seen Ulans on patrol, men mounted as we were and bearing lances like those that had killed the travelers at the Piteous Gate."
Right. And that one I remembered, I have to admit. That one was one thing that I wish I would have mentioned the other day, but he reminded us that there are a couple more.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was probably because Wolfe was getting a lot of questions about it after Claw of Conciliator, even after Claw of Conciliator came out. Severian drills down hard in Citadel of the Autarch. In the very first chapter, The Dead Soldier, it says, "It was much like the old road the Ulans had been blocking when I had become separated from Dr. Talos, Baldanders, Jolenta, and Dorcas when we left Nessus. But I was unprepared for the cloud of dust that hung about it." And finally, probably because he's still getting questions about it, in Earth of the New Sun, chapter 34, Solstice again. "A good end's there," I answered. "I know, thinking as I did how Jonas and I walked there through the forest after the Ulans had scattered our party at the Piteous Gate, of finding wine in our ewer and many other things." I think that settles it. There's really no mystery. It's just Ulans. You are right, Master Spicoli.
We should mention, though, that although that I'm starting to definitely lean that way, that's not necessarily the consensus and maybe not even the majority opinion. I don't know. Because Mark Aramini brought that up too, and he was pointing out that one of the other places where something is mentioned and then never explained is also the thing in the mine at Saltus, and that one common explanation of both of those things is that they both have to do with some kind of defense mechanism or just part of the Autarch's army. And so one reason maybe Severian's not going into details about it is because they're, military government secrets or something like that. And I think there's a place where he suggests that too, where Severian says something like that later on. And maybe is it, I think it's in the conversation he and Jonas have near the beginning of Claw, where even he mentioned something like that. But nonetheless, Mark was just saying that, because something's there or because they are talking about defenses and then something happens to scatter them, that could be possible. The other reason is that so many people are walking there that it would be weird if every day people who are leaving the gate, just got attacked by the Ulans.
Well, okay.
And that's another point too. I know we're far away from that chapter, but still.
We're so far away.
But still, the big climax at the end of the book. Of course, we're interested.
Well, yeah, but I want to drill down on that. Is he saying that the people weren't attacked by Ulans at all?
No, I think that he's saying that they were, and that something else was going on too. And to me, then the question is, well, what? Okay, well, so think about this. This is the one gate that leads north, right? The one big gate that leads out of the city. So if people are going to leave Nessus, they either leave by the river or they leave on this road.
Right.
And tons of people are going, like it's a crowd. Mm-hmm. So it's not like a few people are trying to sneak through the gate. It's like a huge group of normal people. That would make me think, okay, it's okay for people normally to leave on this road if they're all going to go out. I mean, if the Ulans were just going to sit there and attack everybody who came through, eventually nobody would, make the suicide march like this, right? Because they're not all as clueless as Severian at this point. So to me, something else, it seems like, had to have caused this chaos, but I don't know that there's necessarily any clue what they were going for. Like, were they attacking Severian? Probably not, but what are other options? Were they going after Baldanders? Like, did he get noticed? And there's some reason that the Autarch or some of those creatures in there are trying to get Baldanders. Maybe, I don't know. I kind of doubt it. One thing Mark mentioned is that we do know that there have been Undine seen in the river. So was it possible that there was some connection with an Undine, or did they see Baldanders and think it was a giant? But the one point that he brought up that I think is right is that it does happen right in the context of Jonas telling the story about the old woman who has the beans and that she's going to just throw them in the ocean, which is some kind of, I think, pretty obviously weird story to talk about the origin of Abaya and Erebus and these creatures. So with that sort of, I don't know, foreshadowing, I don't know if that's the right term for it at that point, that would make sense, or a kind of hint that maybe something with the Undines is going on, or maybe they've thought that something about some group of people in here has some connection. But I don't know. I mean, even if it is just that the Ulans are guarding the road, what spawned them to
attack at that moment?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Well, we might, if we could ever figure out those beans, we might be able to answer that as well.
Yeah. We got a little time till we get there, though.
Yeah. But Obi-Wan Spicoli actually has his own question. He, in that quote, he says, what I find is interesting is the line in Citadel, the Autarch passage, where he mentions true roads. What is that? He even differentiates them from old roads leading out of Nessus.
Yeah, I don't think we read that part, did we? I can't remember. But he just says, at last the path joined a true road, something I'd heard of often. Yeah, but never trodden except in decay. And so my immediate reaction was a true road would be like an actual paved highway.
That's exactly my thought, is that it was, this is what's left of a highway, right?
Right. And that the roads that they're talking about actually traveling on are, dirt clearing paths, through whatever. So basically he's talking about like Fallout, right?
Yes.
Where, in Fallout world, you have destroyed highways, and then you also have paths that everybody uses. But since they're so broken, they're actually, you can't actually walk on them.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I thought. But I can't rectify the cloud of dust that hangs about it. That's kind of odd. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if anyone has an answer to that, I mean, technically, we don't have to worry about that for 4 years, but still, now it's got me wondering.
It hangs over us like a cloud of dust.
Yeah.
But good. But thanks for that. Thanks for that, Obi-Wan Spicoli. And I just wanted to say that out loud.
That was really good. Rasan Majors reached out to us on email to confirm his agreement with me that the Exultants are riddled with Megatherian allegiances. He offers his own speculation. It's deep into Dr. Talus's play at the House Absolute, which, to be quite honest, I'm really quite intimidated by that. I've already started writing my summary of that chapter, and we might well spend 4 episodes mulling through it. I could see that.
That's a good time to get some expert guests on.
Yeah, so I'll just read his.
We don't have to do it.
Exactly. I don't want to. Yeah, keep my hands off. Keep my hands clean. But I'll just read his theory, and you guys can do something with it if you will. He says, Nod, whom some link to the Megatherians against Gabriel's Hierogrammates, mentions that the son of Meshia takes his daughter to wife and that their children will be exalted. He says, I don't believe that choice of word is accidental. And no, I don't either. He says, I don't read it as literally that the Exultants are offsprings of the Undines, but rather spiritual children, in the sense that the Exultants seem to be children of the age of galactic conquest, an age that the Megatherians imply they would like to see revived if they had their way. That being said, this reference could speak to a more direct relationship between the, quote, other people and the emergence of the Exultant families. Well, too many weeds for me to go into and not get lost. But really, thanks for this, Rasan. I'll keep it in mind when we get there, I swear. He also wants to counter Michael Andre Derisi's excellently argued theory about Jonas's story, since we were just talking about that, the one about the woman and the seeds from beyond the world. Rasan says, I believe that the reference to Cadro of the 17 Stones is a direct reference to Cadro's allegiance to the 17 seeds from beyond the world. I confess that I believe the seeds in Jonah's story are a direct reference to the constantly growing Megatherians. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I mean that's 17. I mean you've got the group of 17. That's the big thing. I mean, even though I think we mentioned, but 17 is definitely a number that Wolf often uses, not just in the solar series, but in or the solar cycle, but in a lot of the things as sort of an unlucky number.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, once you know that the Ashians have that group of 17, and then there are these, everything else, it seems like the number that definitely ties all the bad guys together in one way or another.
But then it's easy for me to like a theory when I don't even have to commit to one until 2021. I need to create a Curiositas Earthus file for things like that, episodes in the distant future.
We have one. It's called Earth.net.
That's true. But then I won't be, I have to go through and say, wait, I had a theory about that. Oh, and if you stop by the Facebook page or look at the profile on our profile on Twitter, you'll see the really cool new logo design for the name Rereading Wolfe that Mike Benowitz created for us. So beautiful. I love that thing. No matter how you do it, no matter how you arrange it, that lettering looks so classic. I just love it. It's perfect. You cannot ruin it.
And why is there a giant red astral body in the middle of things, James? I have no idea.
It seems so random.
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't get it. But thank you so much, Wits. We really appreciate that.
That was awesome.
He's been really cool because he's given us a whole bunch of options and all pro bono.
Yeah. And we are difficult to please. That's the thing.
Yeah.
So.
So since this is such a special chapter that we get Terminus Est, we thought we would have another guest with us this time. So we asked Matthew Keeley, who you have probably read from various essays on Tor.com, and you may remember back from the Earth List. Very active participant back there. So thanks for joining us, Matthew, and maybe we could start by having you say a little bit about what you've written.
I guess a little bit of background. I mean, I worked in the publishing industry for a while, but for the past, like 3 or 4 years, I've done occasional writing for Tor. Usually and on a little bit of everything. So I've written about Gene Wolfe a few times. I've written about Ari Lafferty. I've written about some obscure books that I think should be rediscovered or looked at again, or that kind of cross, sort of genre/literary divide. Obviously, I think that's a pretty artificial barrier. I've written about some movies, like I wrote about Stalker and about some Czech animation. And then I also review current books. So I, reviewed Nina Allen's new book, reviewed Michael Swanwick, people like John Crowley, and they also do some reviewing for the LA Review of Books. So just publish my sympathies with them.
Well, every Wolfe reader hopes to write a How to Read Wolfe article, but you have written 2.
I think, I've wrote 2, and Tor, I think, has republished them under slightly different headline.
This year they republished it under a title, and that's why I missed it. And I said, oh, it's something brand new. And then at first I felt like I had read it, and then I thought this title is almost Wolfian because it gives me the idea that you're going to go through and examine every one of Wolfe's best opening lines. And when is he going to get to the opening lines?
Right. So basically, I that piece I just thought it'd be kind of interesting. People always talk about Wolfe as being this, kind of endlessly subtle writer of unreliable narrators, and you're drawing points between like the 4th book in a series, or like the way in Long Sun there's that literally one letter I that changes the entire arc of the series and your understanding of it. And I thought it would just be kind of fun to look at his openings, because I'd always remembered the opening of The Shadow of the Torturer and a number of his other books. I thought it would be kind of fun to just look at the very, very, very beginning and kind of give a little sense. I mean, not every book of his necessarily had a sentence that I could get really into, but
Mm-hmm.
The Book of the New Sun or Fifth Head of Cerberus, certainly,
Right. Well, he always was good at catching you, at least within the first paragraph. So
yeah, the other article is just kind of one of those, and other people have done similar things, to sort of how to read Wolfe or how to read the Book of the New Sun, because I do think sometimes people talk about, oh, it's like the most challenging and difficult book. And, there are many ways of being challenging and difficult. And Wolfe, I don't think is challenging and difficult in every way, but I think it's also important to talk about the fact that he's a lot of fun in a way that there are some science fiction books that are more popular that I think are a lot less fun.
Yeah.
That was kind of my motivation there.
I remember reading the Foundation series out of a sense of duty when I was in high school. So there are things I really enjoyed about him, but there were parts where I was just like, I feel like I have to read this if I'm going to be into this thing.
Right. Well, and Wolfe has a real style, or actually, I think a number of styles. I mean, like, there's a style of Busan.
Yeah.
He's got that kind of late style that is very dialogue heavy and almost these like Socratic dialogues that dominate some of the older books.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there are certain, especially kind of mid-century science fiction writers who their style is totally generic, just the facts. And then, of course, there are any number of writers whose style is just, I wish you could manage just the facts, but you're just, really bad prose.
Well, what was your first Wolfe book?
I'd love to have like a really exciting answer, but I'd heard he was great, and they said the Book of the New Sun was the best. So my freshman year in college, I bought a copy of that and started Shadow of the Torturer, read it in 2 days, and I said, I love this. It's just incredible. I want nothing more than to read Claw of the Conciliator. And then I thought, wait, there are only 4 books or 5. Let's wait a bit. So I'd read another book and then read the Wolfe after, as pacing myself.
Well, that's contrary to advice, right? Because you said, read fast, but not too fast.
Right. And reread and
Right.
just, even rereading the chapter for tonight's discussion, I was like, oh yeah, I'd forgotten this, or that's interesting, or just as reading actually on my screen, I've got the ebook version. It's like, oh, I can look up that name. What's the significance of that? Oh, there's like some Greek, but there's also some Latin. That kind of thing. It's a very enjoyable way to do it.
Yeah, I think I knew pretty quickly into Shadow at some point when I finally was reading it for real instead of finally paid attention to it. I knew I'd be rereading it. And so I just started chugging through because I was like, I know I'm coming back to things.
Well, when I read it, I didn't know that it was a great work. I just knew it was an interesting author that I had never heard of. And I was carried along by the fact that I knew there was going to be a payoff. All of this weird stuff going on just outside of my view was going to have a big reveal. And then I said, wait, no, I think now I have to find out where I missed it, because I think he must have told me. So,
and that's something that's always interested me, just talking to people who read the book, that they miss the fact that all the towers of the Citadel are spaceships, or they miss some of the convoluted family dynamics at play, to be euphemistic. Or just how many dead people are coming back to life, or people are dying and not noticing it.
Yep.
Also, probably just some of the very Wolfian themes of some of the Catholic stuff. Like, there's that Black Mass in the second book, essentially, which is immensely disturbing. But, I think it's be even more immensely disturbing if you're thinking, oh, wow, this is this kind of perverse Eucharist, which not everyone is going to read as, I guess. So
you met Wolfe at ReaderCon.
Yeah. So I've been on the Earth list, oh wow, for over a decade, and I'd never gone to a science fiction convention at all. But I saw that Wolfe was speaking at ReaderCon in Massachusetts. I'm from Massachusetts, so I just immediately bought a ticket, and I was like, wow, Gene Wolfe and all these other people I admire were going to be there. And so the very first day, I drive up to the Marriott, and I don't think it was Burlington, Mass. It might have been at that time. Middle of nowhere, suburban Boston, Massachusetts, and get my registration complete and go in the opening event. And I see Gene Wolfe at the front of the auditorium with Rosemary. And just shortly after, I just kind of go up, and I'm like, oh man, this is I'm super introverted, and
Oh no! I've been there. I remember the first time I met him. I was so starstruck, and I regret every minute of it. So
so I just go up and say, I'm a huge fan of your work and really admire you, and so that kind of thing. And he was very gracious, and kind of throughout that weekend of the convention, whenever we passed in the hallway, he'd kind of wave or he'd say hi. And the last day when I was leaving, I think he was going to lunch or something, and I'm walking to the car and he's driving by in a car and waves at me, just like a very and you get this, you hear all these stories of him just being such a gracious and kind
yes,
person, mentor to so many people. And just in that very limited experience, that's certainly what I found.
yes,
And also, I don't currently work in publishing, but I worked in publishing for a number of years.
uh-huh,
And the first person I ever met in the industry was David Hartwell, who was
oh,
Wolfe's longtime editor.
right,
And I bought a few books from him at ReaderCon, and I figured out his email address, and I just wrote to him saying, "Hey, I'm a recent college graduate. I'm really interested in publishing. Can you tell me about this?" And he said, "Yeah, I'd love to get lunch." I said, "Yes, I'll do that." We set a date. Of course, I take the bus into New York, which I think he kind of felt guilty about. He's like, "You come out all the way to meet me?" Yes. I don't know that I said that, but
why no?
so it's like I'm going to the Flatiron Building because Tor was still
Right.
until earlier this year in the Flatiron Building, and kind of like staring around and being impressed. And go out to lunch with him, and he's just telling me all these incredible stories. We're both eating. He was talking about Philip K. Dick, who he edited, and Robert Heinlein, who was his favorite writer when he was 12, who he edited, and all this stuff. But towards the middle of the meal, he just kind of like puts his fork down and stares at me. And he's got the glasses and one of his
Hmm.
famous ties, which are kind of very garish. He says, "Well, what do you think about Gene Wolfe?" And this was clearly a very, very important question and I said, "Well, he's my favorite writer," and talked about the Book of the New Sun and the Wizard Knight. And I mean, I think by that time I'd probably read almost everything that had published up to that date. So, I was able to be cogent. Yeah. But, it's just like this very, very clear moment that if I do not want to think what it would have happened if I said, "Oh, yeah, I don't rate Wolfe," or, "Ooh,"
Yeah.
or "He wrote that old Sun book." Right?
It's also a moment where he finds out if you've done your homework right. Like,
Yeah.
Right.
do you know who I am and who I do? And yeah, all that good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, when I was at ReaderCon, one of the books I bought from him that first time was a copy of Operation Aries,
Oh, gotcha.
and I was like,
Oh.
"Wow, this is so cool!" And how much is it? And of course, it's signed, and it's he's like, "Oh, it's $10." So I'm like, "Oh, great! This is such a great deal." And then he looks at me, he's like, "Oh no, I'm sorry, it's actually 5." I'm like, "What?" And even today, I went to an event a few months ago, and it was Claire Cooney, who has a book out with Tor.com. And if you read the acknowledgments to her book, she talks about how much a great mentor Gene Wolfe was to her,
Hmm.
and just that how much of a shadow he casts over the genre. And he may write about the shadow of torturers, but the shadow he casts over the genre is a lot more
Yeah.
benign.
Well, I've heard him talk about advice to writers, and you'd think that he must be very tough on them. But honestly, I've never seen him tough on anybody as far aspiring writer. He's always a very encouraging mentor, as far as I can tell. Maybe once he gets down to the brass knuckles, he gets really tough.
There's the story about Clarion. I know that he was
Right.
on the staff at Clarion one time, and everybody, like so many of the students, turned against him because he was brutally
He
honest.
revolted.
Yeah, from what I understand, and I forget. I've heard the story, I think, from a couple different places, but surely things have gotten advanced. But that he was basically just brutally honest with his opinions about things, and people were
Hmm.
sort of like, "Well, that's not helpful." And he's like, "I'm trying to tell you what I really think and what I think an editor is going to think." And instead of it being like a big, happy everybody supporting everyone else, he was very practical. I don't know. I've never actually been to Clarion, so I don't know what goes on, but I can imagine that, especially among younger people, that might have been a little off-putting, or maybe even more older. I don't know, but I don't know who was there. I don't know anything like that. But
I guess what I'd say about that is just that if you're a writer, you're pouring kind of like heart and soul into what you're writing, and then it's really terrifying to think about like what an editor does, how they react. In my previous job in publishing, there were times when I would be reading something and I'd just be like, okay, I got 10 pages into this novel and I know I'm not going to be recommending it
Huh. Yeah.
and I'm not going to be finishing it. And that's something that I'd be reluctant to tell writers just because with the sheer amount of stuff that comes in.
mm-hmm.
Right.
So, frankly, having that kind of honesty early on in the process is better because, I'm sure there are books that would have been great if only someone had edited them before the agent had submitted them to
Right.
publishers. So,
Well, I remember him talking about his own original beginnings and that he had a very candid editor who cluttered his pages with red ink. And he seemed to feel like that was really very important to him. But so I don't know. It's hard to say how it came off, but it's hard for me to imagine him being cruel.
Well, good. Well, why don't we go ahead, guys, and get into the chapter itself?
Chapter 14, Terminus Est.
Severian has been told that he is being exiled, being sent to be an executioner. More than that, a lictor to the remote city of Thrax, the city of windowless rooms. He's gone to get his things, and he climbs up to the top of the Matakan Tower to look one more time on the Citadel and Nessus from the peak. And then he comes down and returns, as requested, to Palamon's office before he leaves. Palamon says, I have a gift for you. For whatever reason, Palamon does not seem to bear Severian any ill will. Severian had asked how many spoke in his defense, and at first Palamon says, well, more than 2. So that's, Drott, Rosha, and Iada, I guess. And then he stopped and said, more than 3. So perhaps he suddenly remembered to add himself. Severian says that he doesn't deserve a gift, and Palamon agrees, but he notes that if he deserved it, it wouldn't be a gift. It would be a payment. He says, I can't forgive you for what you've done, but I cannot forget what you were. Since Master Gerloes rose to journeyman, I have had no better scholar.
So when we get this little part here, I just like that we're still talking about the little tiny aside about gifts and payment, that there's a little sort of oddly philosophical kind of distinction being made there. But it's still about what you deserve and what you don't deserve, which goes way back, or it goes back to the last chapter. That's very much about trying to decide, what is justice, what's the right thing to do, what's the difference between the right and the legal thing to do, what's the right between the right and the legal and the political thing to do. And we're still getting that here. And even with this gift, it starts off with this sort of weighing of moral options. And I know that's, a lot to lay on just a few sentences there, but it still is going. I just kind of like that because as I was thinking about what we talked about last week, it just seemed appropriate that in all their sort of thinking about what to do with Severian, it seemed like it was just this arcane and sort of confusing, even though it makes sense in the end why they decide to do it. It's all the lines between morality and law and politics are all sort of mixed up and hard to figure out. And the same kind of thing is happening here. Like, I'm going to give you a gift. You don't deserve it, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. And
that's right. Yeah.
And there's not a lot of clarity in, even though I think behind it is just this sense of, Palamon still likes him and he just, there's that behind it, but it all has to come through this weird fog.
Well, this is a very Christian sentiment. It's a lesson that every kid learns in Sunday school, that a gift is free and that if it's not free, then it's wages.
Yeah. Also, by the way, just to note here, we get another point where he's like, "You're the best scholar." We find out later it's because of his memory was one of the main reasons. But
right, yeah. He lays a black case on his desk. It's as nearly as long as a coffin. So, 5.5 feet? That's just the case, though. It has silver catches to keep it closed, and When he opens them, they rang like bells. The clanging of Malrubius's spoon on the bulkhead as Severian drowns, Alton's voice, which tolled like a bell. Now the case of Terminus Est. Bells, bells, bells.
Always at these places where something is happening. And I mean, we will talk about the title of the chapter, but Terminus Est,
Right.
could be the end. It could be the line of division. And we have that bell right there when something's changing, when something's about to happen. That
Right.
sound of the bells is back again.
And it is, of course, Terminus Est. Severian doesn't know it, but it is made by a famous swordwright. Palamon says he's not going to give him the case. He calls it a casket because it would be too cumbersome. He'll give him the sheath and the baldric. That's the sword belt. The sheath is made of sable man skin, which is to say it's not made of the animal, the sable. It's made of human skin, dyed black. Is that right?
That's how I read it.
Yeah.
Which is, is one of those very dark details that you tend to forget.
Right. And it's a term that he's well aware of, like a term for any type of cloth or leather. Oh yeah. I have to go down to the fabric store and get myself a scroll of man skin.
He's not. It's not like if you go to an antiquarian library and they're like, we have this book that is bound in human skin, and it's the thing that freaks out the people on the tour. It's like, yeah.
No, it's the man skin section that they that you've been perusing.
And it's not the first time we see it, right? Because the little bag that he says is made of doe skin at one point that he gets later, or the Dorcas, it's Dorcas who makes it for him, right? Who makes the little bag. Is that that gets called different things. I know that's one of the things that his people often claim his memory is wrong, because there's the little bag that sometimes goes doe skin, but then it's made of man skin later on, if I'm remembering correctly. But it's not the first time Severian's going to carry around a carrier or a little bag of human leather.
The sheath almost envelops the pommel, which means I think that it covers the blade guard as well. The leather is soft, he says, as soft as glove leather. The blade itself, not counting the pommel, is 1 L long. An English L is 1.5 yards, 114 centimeters.
In the last part of Claw, he has an L represents the traditional length of the military arrow. 5 spans or about 40 inches.
All right,
So
okay.
that's how he puts it later in Claw, just in case that's slightly different from traditional English usage. Don't know.
Slightly longer than 1 yard. Yeah,
I didn't go check all my
about
various
1.5
measurements.
yards. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was figuring 45, but when I was doing the calculation, but yeah.
He said about.
I did. I said about. No one's going to get me on errata this time. It's square pointed, which is to say it doesn't have a point. But it has no point because it's for chopping, not poking. It's double-edged with a man edge and a woman edge. This is a society where everything about the sexes is segregated. The edge ends a hand's breadth from the guard.
No, that just is. I have to admit, I don't know a whole lot about swords, but I did look up that the male and female edge, that is a common thing.
Is it really? I looked for that and I couldn't find anything on that.
I found some things that suggested, not that it was like the super common thing in the end, but it was definitely out there as sort of the idea.
Well, did you find out what it meant?
No, but it was mentioned a few times as there being different things. I mean, and it's sort of funny too, if you look up male and female edge sword or something like that, Terminus Est shows up.
Yeah, yes, so that was my problem.
That's why I was wondering, okay, is that really something that's out there, or not? Because it's not a ton. But I did find examples of people talking about the male edge and the female edge, and I'm still not really sure exactly what that means.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it means two sides, but is one wider than the other? Is one longer than the other? I wasn't sure.
Some readers read that as to say you use the male edge on a man's neck and a female edge against a woman's neck. I can't remember that that's in the book, and I couldn't find something when I did a cursory search. So, do you guys know of any? Can you guys remember an event like that? Oh, I used the female edge.
I can't. I'm feverishly searching through my.
Yeah, I don't remember when he executes Morena that he does a lot of details.
At the end of, hold on, chapter 7 of Claw, Aja is asking to die, and obviously doesn't kill her. I sought good footing, and my fingers found the woman's head at one end of the guard, the head that marked the female edge. And a little later again, strike. But by that time I had climbed out of the veil.
Okay, so he does. So he is going to use the female edge for that.
Right.
And does that suggest that each part of the pommel has there's a male head on one side and a female head on the other?
That's what I assume. Yeah, I mean,
Wow.
the woman's head at one end of the guard. So
Gotcha. And that's not. I have to admit, I remember thinking that now, but that's not what I remember when I think about Terminus Est. That it has little heads like that. But
oh yeah, I did that, and in particular, I was reminded when I did the reading.
Yeah.
He has little heads on the guard.
I'm totally
then
looking. Did any of the pictures reproduce that? I don't think so.
I don't know. I have to look. But the guard is made of thick silver, and as you say, there's a head carved on either end. The grip is made of onyx stone with silver bands. There's the opal stone at the end. Severian says that although art had been lavished on the sword, it would have been beautiful without it. He says, quote, "It is the function of art to render attractive and significant those things that without it would not be so. And so art had nothing to give her." Engraved on the blade is the phrase Terminus Est, quote, "curious and beautiful letters." We've never seen Severian study, but apparently he's been studying ancient languages for the last year. He says, quote, "I had learned enough ancient languages since leaving the atrium of time to know that they meant this is the line of division. Also, this is the place of parting, I think elsewhere. And of course, obviously, this is the end."
And what does Typhon call it? Is that what Typhon sees it and immediately says, where's my note?
I think he says separation or
I
parting.
think it's something like that. Yeah. She's Terminus. This is the place of parting. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what he says. Yeah, it's funny. My son's taking Latin in high school, and I just said, Terminus Est, what does that mean? I showed him the chapter earlier today when I was reading it, and he was just like, the end. He's like, this is the end. So, but that's at least what came up to him. And all of those work in a certain way. But I one thing I've always liked about it is how inconsistent the translation of that is.
Right. Well, Wolfe is very interested in the multiple meanings of words, and he'll often translate something in a slightly different way every time.
I mean, I was just thinking as I was reading this chapter about lines of division. I mean, obviously this is a line of division between Severian's previous life and his new life, but also just how in Wolfe the lines of division are often very unclear between, is this science fiction, is this fantasy? Or later on, and I mean also in this book, but especially later on, like, whose head are we in anyways? Because he's got a few people moving around in there, and
Yeah.
like you really can't distinguish necessarily between them, or it's difficult. So it makes sense for it to be kind of ambiguous. You know, you want it to be the sword that just cleanly slices everything in two, but in fact you find that you can't. That there are these, you know, the blade sticks or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Severian's life itself at this point is very much like that of Earth. Earth could continue on going exactly as it is, and just be the Earth that the Megatherians have fated for it, constantly getting colder and colder until it finally dies out. Or it can face a rebirth. It can face an upturning of everything and a new life. And that's what Severian could have stayed at the Matakin Tower, been a torturer among many torturers, and continuing with the guild as, you know, untold number of torturers have done in the past. Or he could show mercy and upturn everything and be forced into a new life that he can't even imagine.
even within this chapter, I mean, he imagines that he is going to spend the night under a tree on the outskirts of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And then he actually discovers, actually, I cannot get to the outskirts of the city. I can get out of the poorer parts and I can get to this bridge. But this city,
Only by walking all night.
right, is unfathom. He cannot fathom the size
Right.
of the city, and so even his young visions of a kind of adventure and travel pale before the reality. I've actually got a little bit of a story that you might recall from the Earth List, but if you were on the Earth List, I believe I posted this here, but I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts, and for many years we had this great museum, the Higgins Armory Museum, now closed, but all of its collections are now at the Worcester Art Museum. And one of the things that they had was the Sword of Justice from Germany around 1700 to 1735. I've got the pulled up on my computer. And it's this ornamental executioner sword that was probably not actually used in execution, but it very much reminded me of Terminus Est. I mean, it doesn't have the fancy mercury stuff going on in it, but it's got that same, the square, it doesn't have a point, it kind of like ends almost like a platter, and it doesn't have the man and woman's head, but it's got all these engravings. It's got a incised figure of justice on the blade, which she's got the scales and the blindfold and all of that. This is, literally on the blade, about halfway up. And the blade is inscribed in German, but they provide a translation. When the poor sinner is deprived of life, then he will be placed under my hand. When I raise the sword, may God give the poor sinner eternal life. So 44.5 inches long, blade itself 35 inches, and it weighs 4 pounds and 10 ounces. If you ever wanted to know, I guess, if you wanted to know like pounds and ounces and not L's and
Stones.
yeah. So the grip, however, is covered in fish skin, not man skin.
Oh, it's a shame.
Yeah. Apparently, you have these blades being made from the last quarter of the 17th century into the first quarter of the 18th century.
Oh,
So
that's really
That's
interesting.
great. When you mentioned that, I pulled up there's a YouTube video of someone showing it, which I'm pretty sure that's the one that you're talking about. I can't tell if it's exactly that, but yeah, it's amazing to look at that. So, and it's exactly like you described.
So I just remember seeing that and being like, "Oh wow, this is a less science fictional, fantastic version of the sword that I know very well from reading Gene Wolfe." Though
Yeah.
perhaps not as well as I thought, because I'd forgotten stuff like the man and the woman head and the man skin. I don't have a perfect memory, unlike some people.
Well, we're not so sure about Severian, so just
Right.
for the record.
I did go to a Renaissance fair in Texas. It's called Scarborough Fair. It's one by Dallas. But one year, I was in my 20s and we had gone back, but someone had intentionally made a type of Terminus Est. Like it was, you know how they have all the blacksmith people who will remake, swords from various books. And this guy had made a Terminus Est, and he said he had the right length, the sword or the pommel and the decorations. He said he totally did his own way, but he didn't have anything obviously to move like the metal on the inside or the liquid metal, but he did have it flattened off. He said he tried to figure out if there's some way he could have made like a clear tube of mercury go down the middle, at least to kind of make it look like something was kind of rushing back and forth, but he couldn't figure out a good way to do it. So, but it was still pretty cool to see the thing right there. And it was huge. I couldn't imagine carrying that around on my back for however long.
It wasn't just 4 pounds.
Right.
Then. Yeah. What year did you go to Scarborough Fair?
That would have been after I had left, but I came back and was visiting friends. It would have been like late 90s, early 2000s, something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think the last time I've been is like 91 or something like that. So
that was the one I always went to when I was a kid. Scarborough Fair was my Renaissance fair. So.
Yeah, they picked the hottest.
Oh yeah,
whatever the hottest week of the year is going to be.
Oh, it was always miserable and just terribly hot. But yeah, but I still went every year.
So when Severian raises the sword, it's as though I wrestled a serpent. He learns that the blade is hollowed and contains hydrogerum, that is mercury. Mercury is actually heavier than iron. The idea is that it makes the blade light to raise, but when you bring it down, the mercury flows to the tip and brings it down heavy when you chop. This is a blade for execution. Supposedly, this will make the blade easier to hold upright for long periods. I suspect this engineering would not be actually as straightforward and practical as described here, but it is a cool idea.
I think swords in fantasy and science fiction, you have to give them leeway for being very cool.
Yeah, you have to have the coolness factor, or what's the point?
And compared to like Michael Moorcock with Stormbringer, it's like, okay, this is a sword with some interesting engineering. It's not like a demon that eats souls.
Right.
It's a triumph of engineering, not Freudian.
No, absolutely. That's one thing I expected. I remember when I first read it, I was like, oh, okay, it's an executioner's sword. So I expected it, honestly, to be like Stormbringer. I was like, okay, is it going to suck in souls or something before I knew what it was? Yeah, I actually kind of like that it's this it stands in the place of a magic sword, but it's not magic.
Yeah, but it turns out that Severian sucks in souls instead.
Well, and then it shatters, and that's a really shocking moment because that's not supposed to happen.
Right.
It's this very cool sword that he's frankly a little bit obsessive about keeping it clean and keeping it in a sheath and keeping it in the whetstone, and it really kind of stings when it breaks.
Right, yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, we're talking all about the physical stuff right now, but this moment is really going to mark Severian because, I mean, how many times does he do absolutely irrational things just to hang on to the sword, right? Or to go back someplace to get it, or to put himself or whoever just in further danger to go find it whenever he loses it. It's not only all the symbol of his role as an executioner, but it also becomes his one link to this older world, right? To his upbringing, to his school. And so when it shatters and he's able to move on, that's actually, I mean, it's just like you said, it's like, it's not supposed to happen, but at the same time, it has to happen for Severian eventually. I feel like to get to that point.
And as for kind of irrational attachment to swords, I mean, you really want a cool sword. I mean, if it's just like the blacksmith knocked it off on an off night, you can say, okay, I can lose that. But I mean, this is a really, really cool thing. As a reader, you kind of get that.
It's amazing still to me too that the way, well, I mean, I shouldn't be amazed, it's fiction, but the fact that it's this tool that's specifically meant for one kind of thing. And every time I think about that moving metal in there, it seems to me like that would make this sword just absolutely terrible and almost useless for fighting, and yet he uses it all the time. Now I could be wrong. It's not handling swords.
You could get used to it, right?
It just seems like if a sword's balance was constantly moving, that would just throw you off all over the place.
I mean, well, the other thing is you can't stab with it, really. I mean,
So
I mean, I guess he's just making when he's fighting, I guess he's making the very unclean versions of the cuts that he would be making when he's properly executing someone.
Oh yeah. Well, think about when he's been being taken to Vodalis and he fights the guys on top of the creature, the elephant type creature. I forgot the name for it. Yeah, and he's beheading people, right? Like that's when he's like beheading people on the fly sideways, and
it's definitely a fantasy sword. He has sharpened it so much that he just cleanly whacks off a guy's head without or a man-ape's arm.
That's
for
right.
that matter. So Palamon gives us a little bit of the ritual that young Severian has apparently already been trained to perform. Hold the sword up as someone prays, and hold it still the whole time during the prayer, and then bring it down at the signal from a quaesitor, some kind of police official from Byzantine Constantinople. Palamon says, "May the Moira favor you." The Moira is a goddess of fate. Incidentally, they were sometimes said to be the children of Erebus and Nyx. Erebus we've met, his consort Nyx will come up later, but the Khan in Nessus has a statue of Nyx above it. In Nordic culture, the Fates are called the Norns, and that name connects them to the Moirai. Aside from being three women, because the Moirai are spinners, spinning out the fates of men as a thread and cutting it off. The name of the Norns means that they are also spinners. Skuld, Verthandi, and Earth. Incidentally, the word Earth could also be pronounced weird.
So when he says Moira there, do you get the sense that that's, I mean, it's impossible to tell, but do you get the sense that that's just more like a sort of common blessing? Or is that supposed to be a momentary glimpse into some sort of mythology or religious moment?
Well, it could be just a saying for all that, could, fate favor with you, may the force be with
I mean,
you.
I don't think those two possibilities are mutually exclusive. I think it can be a kind of standard thing that you say without that has a meaning, a religious meaning that is sort of blurred or
drowned,
but by overuse.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's true. Yeah, I ask because one thing that we've talked about a lot lately is in this section when they talk about going to the cathedral or certain things will show up about religious. Wolfe will call someone names of religious offices or something like that, just trying to figure out how much information is he giving us about whatever the sort of official religion of the world is. Are we supposed to be figuring something out, or is it just supposed to be referencing that there are still these institutions? But I mean, Severian never really explains them that well. But since the Conciliator and the New Sun, of course, are such a huge thing, what's the relationship between those legends and the sort of common religion here? And I don't know if there is a good answer to that, but every time those little moments come up, I always try to pay attention and see if there's some way to tie things together.
The sheath has a pocket, and in the pocket is a whetstone to keep it sharp. Severian puts the whetstone in his sabertesh, his satchel, and then he puts the letter that Palamon gave him to give the Archon of Thrax. He put it in an oiled silk and then puts the whole thing in the sheath pocket. And then he left with the blade slung over his left shoulder.
So that's something I want to keep coming back to because he wears it on his back. And the one thing that stood out to me when they talk about the blade not being pointed was, to me, I mean, of course, a sword is just about always kind of like a cross symbol, but the fact that it doesn't have a point, to me, made it seem even more cross-like. And then the fact that the first time he has it, he slings it over his shoulder. And most of the time, he has that. But what that means is that you've always got this guy with a cross on his back.
Right.
Throughout the whole book. Now, how intentionally symbolic that's supposed to be, I don't know, because how else is he going to carry the sword? but at the same time, that's what we're getting. And one of the first times he has to wear a costume, right? He's dressed up as a pilgrim. And he talks about how he tries to hide this as a cane. But that moment, too, when he's with Agia and wearing the costume, just, to me, it made it even stand out even more to like, oh, what would this actually look like when he's got the sword on his back? Would it look like a sword? Would it look like a cross? Would it? Yeah. So
now let's remember that this is 13 days since the Feast of Holy Catherine, when Severian was elevated. It's in the afternoon because in the last chapter, Palamon had told him that the day was half spent. He leaves the tower and he walks through the corpse door, which we only just recently realized last chapter was in the curtain wall itself. He walks through the door into the necropolis. He walks out of the necropolis through the gate that he and his friends stood in front of in the first chapter. There's a guard there this time, and he doesn't challenge him as he leaves, but he does give him a look. Remember, Severian is in his Fullegan cloak. I assume he's wearing journeyman boots and Fullegan pants. He's not wearing his mask. He's on the east side of the river, Guile. He walks down to the river and then turns north to his right on Waterway. Way is just another word for street. It's the street that runs alongside the river. He's already mentioned that his great shame was that when he learned he was being exiled, he was happy that he couldn't wait to leave. Now he says that it still shames, quote, even after all that has occurred. That afternoon was the happiest time of his life. Quote, all my old hatred of the guild had vanished. My love for it, for Master Palamon, my brothers, and even the apprentices My love for its lore and usages, my love, which had never wholly died, was all that remained. I was leaving all those things I loved, after having disgraced them utterly. I should have wept. I did not. Something in me soared, and when the wind whipped my cloak out behind me like wings, I felt I might have flown. It turns out that torturers are forbidden to smile when they're out into the world. They can only smile in the sole presence of masters, brothers, apprentices, and clients. Clients are treated like family.
That's maybe that's just very, very, very sinister. I mean, maybe. I mean, I'd almost imagine then to have a ritual about that, about like when make another turn on the rack or whatever. That's when you smile.
It's something I had forgotten too until I read this, and I don't know how much that actually creeps into Severian's behavior later on, but it did make me kind of want to make a note to, see, does this come up more often? Like, does Severian intentionally not smile, or when he does smile, is it in particular places? But yeah.
Yeah, there's more rules actually we'll come to about the way he has to act out in public.
But that smile, so, is it his freedom? Is that he just finally feels free? Is that why he wants to smile? I mean, how do you take what's going on in his head here?
Well, he's always talked about how he hated the guild and also loved. And so, now he doesn't have to hate it. It's not part of his life anymore. All he feels is love, and everything is good. He's away from the guild. He loves the guild. He loves his past. He doesn't have to live with it. It's like having a very difficult family.
Yeah, and he says something in me soared, and there's the moment of flying there. And since we're gonna get angel imagery, I guess, with the Hyros and the Hierogrammates, I don't know how to pronounce it later on, but it did make me wonder. There is kind of a nice moment there with leaving the torturers makes him feel like he's free, and specifically flying. And yeah, that's something I think we could all sort of see as just a regular sort of freedom image. But I don't know, to make it say that he specifically, that made me felt like I had wings, that my cloak was out behind me like wings, that connects to that other image later on, that maybe he's on a one step closer towards something else.
He's still going to be a sort of angel of death. I mean, he's supposed
that is true.
Run off to be the lictor. It's not like he's
right.
Severian, you're a bad torturer, go to med school or something. It's like, no, you can go be the provincial executioner, which perhaps is a little less horrible and intense than the literal mothership of the guild, but it's still not great.
Right.
Well, when he gets to Thrax, he's going to find out it's not so different from the guild, actually. So,
and then that moment where he says, "I thought there were many more days like this to come," and I think, does he mean days of freedom? And then he got sucked back into as the autarch, that more things came onto him, or is there more? Is that more about, pretty soon he was going to be back to working like someone in the guild. I just wasn't sure.
Yeah, he's not going to be free anymore, right? He's going to be back to the grind. Everything's going to get complicated when he's not doing that job that he believes in, that he's been trained in, that you have to, in some sense, loathe. Yeah. He because he can't smile in front of people, and yet he can't stop smiling. He pulls his cloak around his face so people won't be able to see him. Like you said, he fears he'll probably die before he gets to Thrax, and that he'll never return to the Citadel. He also figures that every day will be as happy as this one, and he says, all wrong. He doesn't really understand how big Nessus is. He thinks he'll be out of it before dark and be able to camp out in the country, but he hasn't even gotten out of the slum of Nessus by sunset. Remember that the Citadel is in the oldest portion of the city that is still populated. He says it would be suicide to ask to stay with any of the people there or sleep on the streets. So he just keeps walking. But now, less than 20 miles from home, no one even recognizes him as a torturer by his clothes. But we're going to find out that that is not actually the effect that he's having.
Right.
But for him, he assumes that they only see him as only a somberly clad traveler who shouldered a dark paterisa. And there you go. A paterisa is a staff with a cross at the top of it. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, this is a staff that bishops carry. I think that is probably the simplest explanation. There's a lot of different definitions. But for people who think the torturers are supposed to be the descendants of the Catholic Church, the reference could be important.
So do you think he's right about that? Like, is it, somberly clad traveler who shouldered a thing? So he thinks that people don't think it's a sword? Or is he
he's
wrong?
causing, he doesn't think he was noticing it when he's on the bridge, and he's causing a big disturbance. So, no, obviously he's having some kind of effect on people, because these people are closer to the Citadel than even there. So he says that sometimes, sailing on the river, he saw a gilded thalamagos, an ancient Egyptian term for a house barge. Lamps on the bow and stern. Lamps to show off their gildings. They also sailed in the center of the river to prevent being attacked from shore.
Yeah. So first, one point about the going through the center of the lane is that's one of the first times I think that he suggests that just traveling on the river could be dangerous.
Well, you can't even sleep in the street. It's got to be dangerous to have a big fancy boat sailing along.
Yeah, I guess so.
But they had multiple oarsmen rowing them along, and they would sing. Severian records their song. Row, brothers, row. And then they'd pull the oars. The current is against us. And then they reset the oars. Row, brothers, row, pull. Yet God is for us. Row, brothers, row. The wind is against us. Row, brothers, rowed. Yet God is for us. And this is the first use of the word God in this book. It's the only one in Shadow of the Torturer.
But yeah, so the song or the chant, it's about the current is against us, but God is for us. So there's, circumstances push you one way, but then there's, predestination, something divine pushing you the other way.
But you're also rowing.
Right, you're also rowing. Yeah, yeah. So you're still working. Yeah, but it's not completely all there. Yeah, predestination. But it is also, a little bit of a good point of what Severian's going to be like, the kind of forces that are going to be pushing him in a bunch of different directions here. And like you said, he will still be rowing, but there's going to be tons of other forces working all around him. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also, Wolfe loved Kipling. And this is very much a kind of Kipling-esque verse that he would put in the middle of a story just for flavor.
Also, we're talking about the word God. These are people. They row. They're kind of, for lack of a better term, working class. They're not talking about the excruciate all day. Mm-hmm. They're using a very colloquial language. And with Earth, that we always get Severian's point of view, and he's this apparently the great scholar with the eidetic memory. His diction and is always going to be a little more elevated, but here, because he's quoting people verbatim and a song, we're getting a little bit more of the little less stylized version, the how the person on the street talks, not the torturer and the guild or the nobleman under the sword.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's very true. The one thing, and this is more of a question, not a disagreement, but the one thing that gets me about that is that when he does meet Agia later on, she seems like super versed in all kinds of stories about the conciliator. She doesn't always want to say a whole lot about it, but she knows various myths. He tries to question her about the conciliator and things like that.
Oh boy, do I have curiositas Earthus.
But and I think you're absolutely right. Like, this is what I always felt like that was showing a little bit too, but then I always get confused between, and I think this is back to why I was worried or wondering about the setup of what this world's religion was, because I was never sure exactly what was odd theology, what was sort of orthodox, were those distinctions made? And the vibe I get a lot of times is that there really maybe isn't something totally orthodox, that it may just be as so old and as complicated as, anything else, where you just have a big mix of lost and misunderstood traditions that are kind of interacting with each other.
It could be such an old song, they're using a very, very old, archaic word.
And that could be true. That could be part of it too. It's hard to know. I kind of like that idea. But yeah, no, I think that point too, though, about that, you're right about Severian does come from a very, I don't necessarily say prestigious, but a very narrow background, and a very sort of, he's had a certain kind of education that lets him talk about things where, and from his perspective, since everything is from there may be whole common ways of living and thinking and acting and talking that in this world that we just don't see directly.
So Severian walks all night. It must be close to dawn, so doesn't actually see the sun rising, but it's obviously very early in the morning. And Severian comes to a bridge. It's not clear whether the waterway ended on the eastern side, and he has to cross the bridge to the western side, or if he just chose to. The waterway was completely unlit. He walks up the stairs to the bridge. The bridge is well lit, torches on staves every 10 yards or so. Every 100 yards, there's a bartizan, a turret for watchmen and weaponry. There's a guard's room for each, and it is also well lit. The bridge is actually crowded with people and carriages. Some people have link boys, someone to carry a torch in front of them. Apparently, he's finally left the southern slums of Nessus. There are vendors here selling things on the bridge. There are externs, that is, people from other places who speak unknown languages. There are beggars showing their sores. They also, quote, feign to play flageolets and ophicles. Flageolet is like a recorder. An ophiclide, I'm not pronouncing that right, but an ophiclide, as we've said, is a type of brass instrument. They pinch their children to make them cry. Everyone has something to sell, and that is what beggars have. It seems that his torturer training is, to be formal and disinterested in public at all times. So he deliberately does not, quote, gawk at the spectacle going on around him, despite his admitted interest. He draws his hood over his head and looks directly in front of him at all times. Now, I don't understand this phrase. I passed among the crowd as indifferent to it, but for a short time at least, I felt my fatigue melt away. My strides were, I think, the longer and swifter because I wanted to remain where I was. That seems contradictory.
I think it's just the kind of almost like Chestertonian paradox that Wolfe would relish, that he's given strength by this, and yet he knows he's not supposed to be there. He feels kind of out of place. He wants to be there. This sort of divided loyalty, which is pretty typical of Severian, and that he's the torturer who shows mercy. He wants to do the one thing, does the other. He's constantly killing the wrong people and sparing the wrong ones. So I mean, I was really struck by this sentence as well, and I just thought it was very psychologically true and concise. That it's just explaining a whole feeling in a very short sentence.
Yeah. And as soon as you said Chestertonian, I was like, it clicked. I was like, oh yeah, it's more aphoristic. It's like more like an aphorism than it is sort of a description of exact, but it works so well. Yeah, I think that's great.
The security on this bridge are not roundsmen, that is essentially beat cops. They are peltists, an ancient Greek soldier in light armor. So they are different from the cataphracts that we saw at the tower, who were fully enclosed in silver armor. These peltists are in half armor, whatever that means. They carry transparent shields and blazing spears.
The spears I wanted to mention because the blazing spears, they're repeated enough that when we're thinking about how certain groups have more technology than others, the one thing that struck me this time was like every time you see the guards, they've always got their lightning spears or whatever. I always think of something. There's something in Star Wars. I forget which one of the guys are that they have something that's got lightning on the end of their staff or whatever. I forget. Imperial Guard, maybe, I can't remember. But it hit me. I'm like, oh, that's the weapon they always have. And it's like, so yeah, they do have some. There is higher technology for the wealthier, for the army or something like that. But there's not a ton of variety. That it's always these guys always have these spears. I don't know if that's a big deal or not, but it just.
Oh, I think it's obviously along with the transparent shields, it's obviously supposed to invoke a type of science fictionary idea. Perhaps they have, instead of lightsabers, they have little light spearheads at the ends of these things. Severian's almost crossed the bridge when two peltas stop him for impersonating a kind of officer. Apparently, being an unknown Carnifex is remarkably rare here, rare enough that it hardly seems credible that he would not be an imposter.
And they even say it's straight up, it's a crime to wear those clothes. Like that's
so they know the clothes, but they don't believe he could possibly be someone in that.
Which implies all kinds of things about what the legends of this are, but also if it's not just legends, I mean, if it's a crime to wear that, then there's got to be some seriousness about like you cannot pretend to be that thing because there are official people who are Carnifexes.
Well, apparently they are the clothes, not necessarily of a journeyman of the order, but of a Carnifex.
The Carnifex, yeah, that's right.
So I would somehow, I just think Carnifex is got to be fairly common. So perhaps every Carnifex that would be nearby is already registered. Just like you don't work at the Carnifex office. So Severian says that this is his habit, the uniform of his guild. He's not a mere Carnifex, but a journeyman of the Order of Seekers of Truth and Penitence. And now they're really dubious. So they bring him in to talk to their locage. A locage is a company officer. A locus is a company in ancient Greek military. The bartizan is entered up a little stair. It has a narrow doorway, one room with a table and a few chairs. The locage is wearing a cuirass, that is, a breastplate and backplate that are fastened together. He sits at a high desk, like a cop at the police station in old movies. He's writing with a quill. Note the mix of science fantasy and high fantasy tropes. The two peltists have come along. The guy who first spoke to Severian says, "This is the man," and the locage says that that's obvious. The peltist tells him that Severian claims to be of the Guild of Torturers. The locage doesn't look up, but says, "I had never thought to encounter such a thing outside the pages of some book, but I dare say he speaks no more than the truth." This tells you how little people really move around in Nessus. Severian is no more than 50 miles from the Citadel. The locage wipes his quill, puts sand on his document to keep the ink from pooling into the parchment. He finally looks up and he tells Severian that he himself ordered the peltists to detain him because his clothes were causing a disturbance. The guards reported him as soon as he walked on the bridge. I notice that Severian doesn't mention his appearance causing a disturbance because, he wasn't aware of it.
He doesn't have any prior knowledge of what the city is normally going to look like. I mean, he's like, "Oh wow, this is very exciting and vibrant," and he doesn't realize it's that exciting and vibrant because everyone is freaking out about this random Carnifex coming through.
Right.
Well, for all he knows, they're always like that, and Carnifexes are a normal sight.
And he's going out of his way not to look people in the eye. And now it just occurs to me that perhaps the reason for that type of training is because a member of the guild is always going to cause a disturbance whenever he goes out in public. And you're not supposed to acknowledge that. The locage says, "If you are of the Guild of Torturers," which is, to be honest, I had supposed been reformed out of existence long ago.
Except the one thing about that, but that's an attitude that's actually oddly enough, it's one of the few times that I feel like regular people in this book think about their own society as having made progress.
Oh yeah,
like
that's a
it's
good
the
point.
only time I can think that someone says, "Oh, I thought we would have gotten rid of that thing a long
Yeah.
time ago." As if, but in other places, every other time we're talking to people, there's more that sense of we just live in a world where there's been things accruing on things, and it's all sort of a mess and whatnot. And that really stands out to me, just because I can't think of another time, apart from some of the things that Vodalus tries to say, that really make it sound like the world is progressing rather than just having sort of done the same thing forever or forgotten where it was. So
Yeah, the kind of stagnation.
yeah.
Well, Wolf has kind of created a situation for Severian that he is always a fish out of water. If he leaves the Citadel, he's where he doesn't belong. If he walks a few miles from the Citadel, and he's become a figure from fairy tale books. If you are of the Guild of Torturers, you have spent your life in the, what do you call it? The Mannequin Tower. No, he says, I mean the place where your tower stands, the Citadel. So the Locage can't even remember the name of the Citadel. He only knows that it's north of the very northern side of the Algedonic Quarter. He went to the Great Keep as a cadet, but he calls it the Donjon. He asks how often Severian has gone into Nessus. Severian says, often. He thinks of all the times he swam in the river. And the Locage says, dressed as you are now? And no. He tells Severian to pull back his hood so that he can see his face. He gets up off his stool, and then he walks to the window and looks out. How many people do you think are in Nessus? No idea. No one knows. They keep trying to count them without success because the city grows and changes overnight. This reminds me of Severian's statement at the beginning of the book about the city reconstituting itself each morning. They try to tax the people systematically without success. It's a libertarian's ideal, a self-organized city where the official government is only a fly on the horse's back. Apparently, the best they can do is police the other members of the government. So the buildings, like I said, the city is constantly changing every night. Buildings are built in the streets at night by people who just build the structures from cobblestones of the street. He mentions the exultant Telericon. Saint Telericon was unremarkable aside from getting himself declared a saint. But this Earth Telericon was a notable statistician of human mundanity. The Locage speaks of his madness, but I think that's just his term for nerdishness. Well, what we're doing here is our madness.
It made me think of London labor and the London poor, like the
Right.
kind of, anthropologists of poverty.
Yeah. So.
Right.
That actually, just on that fits actually in a lot of ways the things we talked about with the Dickensian side of so much of these first chapters. To have someone like that, like you said, that sort of London poverty kind of thing, that's perfect for so much of the other things that are Great Expectations like, or as Nigel pointed out, Nicholas Nickleby like.
Right. The Locage might deride Telericon, but he is actually a fan because he's very familiar with his statistics. Telericon claimed that the people who live on garbage of others were 288,000, that there were 10,000 begging acrobats, evenly divided between men and women, and that the city increases its population essentially every couple seconds. Quote, that if a pauper were to leap from the parapet of this bridge each time we draw a breath, we should live forever, because the city breeds and breaks men faster than we respire. He concludes that, quote, among such a throng, there is no alternative to peace. Disturbances cannot be tolerated because disturbances cannot be extinguished. Do you follow me? So now we finally got back to Severian.
But that idea about the population of the city seems very, I don't know, and I don't know if I'm looking for the right kind of consistency here, but there are other parts where, as they talk about how the city moves and it leaves whole parts behind it, like they talked about where the omophagists, right, the people
Mm-hmm.
who were afraid to light fires, and how there's sort of this blight of Nessus that gets trailed behind it. It makes it, like, I've often wondered, this makes it seem like the population is just expanding, whereas other parts seem like it's thinning out quite a bit.
Well, it could still be expanding north faster than it's dying out south.
I suppose so. Yeah, it's trying to get that idea, like Matt, you mentioned about how stagnant the society is. But this little part, when he talks about that, feels slightly less stagnant. Like maybe it's crazy growth, but at least it's still growth. And again, it's one little moment that goes against, to me at least, goes against the grain of so much else that gets described to us in the first part of the book. So I don't know. I'm just not exactly sure how to take it.
Well, Russia does say that everything is getting smaller and smaller. So, these statistics may be old.
I guess that's true. That goes back to the weird forms of learning here, where maybe he read his one book and it could have been from thousands of years ago. Yeah, right.
It's his favorite book, but it was, very old. So he says that disturbance cannot be tolerated because disturbances can't be extinguished. Severian unwisely corrects him. Actually, there is the alternative of order. But yes, until that's achieved, I understand. The Lokaj says, whatever. The point is that he needs to wear street clothes. Severian can't go back to the Citadel, he says. Then get out of sight tonight and buy something tomorrow. Do you have money? A little. Then buy them, or steal them, or take clothes off your next executed victim. He's not going to have guards accompany him to an inn. There's been some kind of trouble on the river, and they're telling each other too many ghost stories out there already. There's a fog on the river. It will only make things worse. Do we get any explicit hint about what's going on the river? Obviously, it could be Juturna, a giant mermaid, following Severian as he walks along the river.
That's what I was wondering, because she said that they followed him, right? Like she says later that we followed you and we started following Baldanders when we lost you, and she found back. So I assume, looking back, that that's what it is. That there's an Undine, if it's her or if it's another Undine that's following him.
And he's supposed to buy street clothes, but he never does.
Yeah, he ends up going to the inn and pushing his way in. So, but I was thinking, I'm trying to think back to then the part where they're talking about rowing on the river, and they never really mention anything about Juturna, I don't think. But that's what I assume he's referring to, is that, that's something, of course, we're not going to even find out that she was following him until Claw. I mean,
right,
later,
exactly.
A long time ago. But I assume that's what he means.
Severian explains to Lokaj that he's been appointed to Thrax. Now the Peltist, who has been speaking, chimes in. His name is Petronax, and he's standing to Severian's left. St. Petronax was an Italian priest sent to examine the ruins of an abbey, and once there he gathered a bunch of hermits and rebuilt the abbey and became their leader. Petronax says, "Do you believe him, Lokaj? He's shown no proof." The Lokaj has never met a member of the Guild of Torturers, but he has heard something of them. He's back to looking out the window. It's true there is a fog coming in because Severian can see a brownish mist, ochre, he calls it, forming above the river. The Lokaj asks Petronax what Severian smells like. The Petronax doesn't answer, so the Lokaj says, "Rusting iron, cold sweat, putrescent blood. An impostor would smell of new cloth or rags picked up from a trunk. If you don't wake to your business soon, Petronax, you'll be north fighting the Asians." So it's like Hogan's Heroes, where people are always being threatened with being sent to the Eastern Front. Also, here's where we get the first sense that Severian smells quite pungent. So Petronax says, "But Lokaj," and he gives Severian the stink eye. Petronax appears to be a particularly annoying charge to the Locage. So he says to Severian, "Show this fellow you are indeed of the Torturers' Guild." Severian knocks his transparent shield aside with his right arm. With his left foot, he steps on his right to hold him in place, and then crushes a nerve in Petronax's neck that induces convulsions. And that's the end of the chapter.
Which is a cool little moment because it's the first time we really get the sense of how like trained they have been. I mean, the only time up to this point, right? The only fight we've seen has been with the boys, right? Where when he takes over the apprentices. That's the only. Is that right? Or
I assume something? They're all very deadly fighters.
Well, so I was going to say,
no wonder that he has to have help.
No kidding, but it makes that scene where, he grabbed people and slammed his head against the wall and, did all other kinds of stuff. That apprentice fight must have been really brutal. I mean, in just amazingly awful ways. But yeah, so obviously, part of his training, isn't just torturing people who are, tied down already. It's actually doing all kinds of fighting stuff too. So I guess the thing to look back at it now is, it's called Terminus Est, of course, because we get the sword. Like Matt had mentioned before, it's also the big line of division between his earlier life and the rest of the book and his pilgrimage. We're also getting other lines of division between what he thought was the center of Nessus and how other people don't even really recognize that the Citadel is even really a thing.
Right.
And so we've got not just physical and not just time divisions, but also the first time that Severian's, not the first time. I think Thekla really changed his attitude towards a lot of things, but also the first time he's learning really how different parts of his society are from what he had expected, what he assumed things would be like. Yeah, so I mean, I think that calling the chapter Terminus Est and thinking about how it's about separations and differences and borders seems perfect. I mean, a bridge over two sides of the river. There's all kinds of things in there about the structure of just the images that we get. Mm-hmm. Too. Needing to change clothes, going from one set of clothes to another set of clothes, attitudes. Yeah, it works really well. Not that that's surprising, but it's fun to see it all, actually.
Well, what did you think, Matt?
Well, been great to be here, and also just makes you want. I mean, I've got enough books to read. Wants me to. I need to go back and read the Book of the New Sun again.
Well, that's actually why we do this, so we can read it.
I appreciate you coming because we kind of wanted to intentionally make it a little bit like the old Earth List, where we just get different people, mm-hmm. Interacting.
Now, do you have a random theory about this chapter that you've been nursing all this time?
I really wish I did that. I had like some kind of like crazy thing. It's like, if you read the first letter of every sentence and run it through, but I don't. No, I mean, for me, I just really love this chapter just because it's not the beginning of the book, but it is a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And it's both. I think so many of the covers of the book, I mean, not the one in the U.S., but it's just like Severian sitting out with the sword over his back, and that's really this chapter.
Even though it's very plottish, I mean, it's just plot, it does give you finally a real picture of the society that Severian lives in.
I mean, he didn't really live in society before this,
Right, that's true. And also there is kind of an allegory here, not an allegory, an elusive nature to the chapter, that this is the line of division. This is Severian is making a choice to set out rather than just continue doing things as they have been. And that is a kind of, that's a kind of an eschatological story right in there, that you have an ending and a beginning.
And, it's almost also kind of like a relief, that he's not thinking about Thekla. He's not thinking about his crimes or the friends. He has this, kind of brief moment of freedom.
But that's even that is just like the end of Earth and the beginning of Ushus. He has a lot to be guilty. It's in a way a shame to be so excited about the new rebirthed Earth, considering all the lives that were lost, and yet
It also, not when we put it that way, it makes me wonder too, because before this, he's been terribly sad about Thekla. And does he even really mention Thekla in all of this? I mean,
no, no,
yeah, and
No.
that's done.
yeah, and he talks about how that little moment when he smiles with everything there. That is a kind of, I mean, I don't want to say cold by any means, but he's not thinking about Thekla at that point, about missing her, or I don't want to say he has to feel guilty at every stage or feel sad about it, but it is telling, I think, that even at this like incredibly important moment in his life that he doesn't mention Thekla. And I don't know if that's something about him still being a youth, or still being very immature in certain ways, or maybe it's just the relief that he's not going to die. It could be something as simple as that he's going through elated, or he's being very elated. But if you are looking for reasons to think that Severian is particularly cold in certain ways, that his not mentioning her could be good evidence.
He doesn't ever call Thekla his friend, at least not up to this point. She calls him her last friend, but only when literally she knows that she has no other friends. And he shows her mercy. He says that he loved her, but I think maybe he showed her mercy, and debt's paid.
Maybe so, but he loved her enough to basically throw away his life. Yeah. So yeah, no, that was just the one other thing that stood out to me that I definitely wanted to mention, was that there's really no thinking about Thekla in everything that we get. Now, he's definitely going to come back later. Like, it's not like she's gone from his mind now, but just in this moment,
he will bring it up again.
Oh yeah, so. Oh yeah. But just in this moment, she's absent. So
he'll get out his little black book and start listing all the girls that he knows.
Well, we do,
and categorizing them.
We do meet Azir here pretty soon, and the first thing he talks about is basically, and she was hot.
Yeah. Well, she wasn't hot.
Well, I mean,
and yet alluring. That's what
alluring. Yeah. So I mean, yeah.
It says, I don't really know why I was attracted to her. Okay. Well, that was great, Matthew. What are you up to nowadays? You got anything to pitch?
No, I mean, I'm continuing to write, and hopefully I'll be writing some more about Wolfe soon. But I'll definitely be sure to let you know if I do.
Oh yeah,
and looking forward to hearing this episode and the subsequent ones. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, if you have any comments or complaints or corrections, you can, of course, always reach us on the Rereading Wolfe Facebook group, where a lot of people are quite active. Also, you can reach us on the Rereading Wolfe Reddit page. You can always, of course, check out our Instagram page. And if you don't feel like talking in front of everybody, you can just contact us at rereadingwolfe@gmail.com. And yeah, this has been really good.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and thanks again to Matthew Keeley for coming with us, and we'll see everyone next time.
What's new to know? Baby started burning up the curtains. What's thought a lot, a little bit too slow. We can't stop the show. Everybody's staring like a painting. Better get in good before the get-ins go. Stop your love. Go on, get it. You can't help yourself. Go on, get it. You can't stand it long. It's too strong. Thick black line that separates right from wrong. 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 What's got you low? Baby coming home a little late now. Maybe get to bed before you get on home.
So Matt, real quickly, yeah, we do go really slow through this. hope you're okay. Hope you're not bored to tears.
No,
So,
I'm good.
Okay, good.